Thanks, Paul, for inviting me to talk, and I think Kayla had something to do with that too. And thanks for coming along in these terrifying times. But what I want to, as Paul said, I'll talk about these methane seep deposits. Now, these are coal seeps. They're not hydrothermal seeps. So they're coal seeps. And the key words here are Sacmarian at the end of the main late Paleozoic glaciation, and the Irwin Basin, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It's been variously grouped as part of the northern Perth Basin, but it's a distinct basin. It should be thought of as such. Macaroni Hill, and the name Macaroni, you'll see the significance of that. And the Holmwood Shale, this unit, the shale unit, in which these seep deposits occur. Now, a paper it's being typeset at the moment in PaleoCubed, and so you'll be able to see it there within a couple of days, I suspect. And my co-authors, and I'm very grateful for their contributions, of these people, a whole range of people have contributed. And as Paul said, I'm at the Oceans Graduate School, which I have to acknowledge. So the significance of this find, and Peckman, in his review of our paper, said that this was a fantastic discovery. And he pointed out, although there have been other records of methane seeps in the Permian, he discounts those, and he says this is the first record of Permian methane seeps. And the other reviewer, who was unnamed, said that this the description of these seeps make them the best documented for the Paleozoic. So we've got a really significant geological find here. When you interpret ancient marine environments, you really have to take note of the geological setting. That constrains the interpretation. But it's the modern analogues that you compare the ancient rocks with that are really critical. And that's the case here too. Now, for methane seeps, for coal methane seeps, and even for hydrothermal seeps, the critical factors are there are carbonates produced in these seeps, are the cement fabrics, the stable isotope values, and the biota. And so this is what I'll talk about today. There's much more work to be done on these seep deposits, but these are the critical factors. So I'll go through them. But let's say something about what we've got are carbonate nodules and crust. And not in our deposits, we haven't got columns. But the carbonate is precipitated by the AOM microbes, archaea and bacteria. And this reaction here results in an increase in alkalinity and then precipitation of carbonate in the muds or sands that the seeps are in, and just below the water surface. And here you can see on the northwest shelf these active seeps with carbonate nodules exposed. So they're not, here they're carbonate crusts, which are layered crust, but here nodules. Our seeps are more nodular, like this. This is in shallow water on the northwest shelf. So seeps, of course, can be very shallow water. They can go up into the intertidal zone, and even there are seeps on land. There are huge mud volcanoes. There are gas seeps everywhere where I work in Timor, New Guinea. There are seeps everywhere. But we're interested in these coal seeps, submarine. And they occur from very shallow water to very deep water at continental margins. And of course, you rarely make a discovery without it being previously recognised in some way. But the significance of what was recognised was not known, was not put together. And in this magnificent mapping by Professor Clark and his colleagues, this is major prendergast, and you can see that she would have kept Kurt Tykert and Rhodes Fairbridge in order in the field. No wonder that EDC Clark is looking so smug there. He knew that the lads weren't up to anything at Minganyu or wherever. But they did magnificent mapping, and of course they had student groups there from UWA just after the Second World War. And you'll notice on this map that Macaroni Hill is named there. Now, at Macaroni Hill, in a passing mention, they said it was a circular reef, and they said it was cement stone, and that it had there were unusual fossils there. But it was just a passing mention. They didn't really know the significance. They made more of a point of this line of ammonoid occurrences. One species of ammonoid, Duracinites, which goes to about 30 centimetres in diameter, is and was prolific. Many of the specimens have been collected, but you can still go there. And you see over here another occurrence, and there's another occurrence over here. It's now known to be repeated by faulting. The same bed with Duracinites, and there's another smaller ammonoid that I'll talk about. Now, ammonoids are extremely rare in the Australian Permian. I don't think there are any in Eastern Australian Permian. And they're very rare in the Western Australian Permian, except in this narrow stratigraphic interval. Now, people like Glenister, who just came after these people at UWA and then went off to US. Kurt Tykert and Rhodes Fairbridge made their names in the US after being at UWA. And the same with Glenister. And Glenister realised, and his colleagues realised, that there was one stratigraphic interval, a very narrow stratigraphic interval. And it's the stratigraphic interval that we now know contains these seep deposits. We have looked at 4 localities, but there'll be many others. Macaroni Hill, another one between Mesa 3 and Mesa 4, and another one further over here at a repeat of the Duracinites bed. And here in Wallaga Creek, this is Jeff Playford. Now, some of you will be thinking that, oh, he's going to introduce Jeff as Phil Playford's brother, but I won't. Jeff is an internationally renowned scientist, researcher, stratigrapher, who is best known from his work in the Carboniferous. He's a palynologist. He's in his mid-80s, and he's still active in Queensland, at Queensland University. And he did the palynology for this paper. Tremendous worker. And he mapped out the Wallaga Creek in 1959 and mapped what he called Wallaga limestone with Jurasonites in. And he described in his honours thesis, I think done in 1958, 1957, he described these fantastic cement fabrics, but just recorded them as strange cement fabrics. He, at that stage, he became a palynologist. He had not looked at these nodule beds, these nodule, the mudstone, the carbonate nodules for palnomorphs. But we sent him samples, and with the help of Daniel Mantle at MG Paleo here in town, who processed the material, Jeff got perhaps one of the best preserved palynology assemblages from the Permian anywhere in these nodules. And he documented that in this paper in the Journal of the Royal Society of Western Australia. And he took an active part in our paper after so many years away from the Wallaga limestone. So that gives you, these deposits were originally described way back in the 1950s in very sort of cursory detail. Now I want to debunk two myths about the Permian. And one myth is that our sedimentary basins in Western Australia were on the margin of Gondwana. But at this time, this is the Irwin Basin here that we're talking about, we had, what have I done? Oh, there it is. Sounds like an earthquake.
Someone tunneling out of Perth.
What?
Someone tunneling out of Perth.
It might be the police raid. They'll be in here shortly. This is what we call the East Gondwanan Interior Rift, and there are marginal rifts that splay off, including the Bonaparte Basin, the Canning Basin, and this series of basins from the Merlin-Lee to Irwin basins. We have perhaps blocks like Lhasa and southwest Borneo and other blocks. I'm dealing with this paper on the moment on early Jurassic Uid limestones and the origin of those. But this is the Mesotethyan rift. So in the early Permian, the time that we're interested in is between 300 and 290 MA. In the early Permian, that, at least in this part, had not opened. It opened in the Iranian area first, and then progressively opened to the north. Just like later in the mid-Jurassic to earliest Cretaceous, the East Gondwanan Interior Rift opened from the north to the south progressively. So our basins, our Permian basins, are interior basins in the interior of the continent. And it was a rift system that went through fairly stable continental crust. This is what we call, in terms of topography, the East Gondwanan lowlands. The Permian orogenic belts were over here in the east, encompassing eastern Australia. And you can see on this basement terrain map, here is this interior, the marginal rift from the Merlin-Lee Basin is M4, the Biro Kalaleya Basin, and then the basin we're interested in, the Irwin Basin here. And you can see it coming down here, the Irwin Basin, the Kalaleya Basin up here. And this Dandaragan Basin over here has a completely different subsidence history. to the Irwin Basin and to these basins, this string of basins along here. Unfortunately, the stratigraphy here has been taken from this basin and confused. So this shows a geological map, but we've got 4 localities, and the localities are just above the contact between the Nangeti Formation here, which is glaciogene, diamictites and so forth, and the shales. We don't know the full thickness of the Homwood Shale because of faulting in the upper part. But we know that we've worked out that these seeps are approximately from 60 to 90 metres above the base, the contact with the glaciogene deposits in the lower Homwood Shale. And the other thing, the other myth that I'll debunk is the idea that the Permian was cold in Australia. That this, I learnt when I was a student, that this was the time of the Great Ice Age, the Permian. That's wrong. The height of the Ice Age was in the Pennsylvanian, the late Carboniferous. We have massive hiatuses in all our basins at that time. And we recognised some years ago with Vladimir Davidov and you, Jay, and myself, we recognised a coral tubiphyte reef in Timor to the north in the East Gondwana and Interior Rift. And that signified an abrupt warming in the later Scazzalian. And that's the time when the Nangeti Formation in the Irwin Basin and the Lyons Group in the Merlinley Basin started to deposit diamictites and so forth. That's the time when the ice sheets over this part of the world started to melt and provide this mass of glaciogene sediment. That was all gone by this time in the early Satmarian. There's no evidence in the East Gondwanan lowlands of any ice sheets. There's evidence in this coal spike here with sea ice in the mid-Artinskian. But the rest of it, we've got warm spikes and we've got temperate conditions. And you can see this if you look. We have been, these papers, this series of papers, is looking from this Irwin Basin, the Perth Basin, northwards to Timor. And I think we're the first group to have a comprehensive view of that. Now these basins, this line of N4 to N7, they have common features in that the strata are almost horizontal still, away from faults. You get drag folding along faults. And this indicates, and because the facies are widespread across, the same facies is widespread across the basin. Up in the Merlinley Basin, you can recognise the same limestone bed, widespread for, almost 100 kilometres or so. There's been a low gradient seafloor. This, unfortunately, the Geological Survey nomenclature of troughs and so forth and terraces is just nonsense. They've applied physiographic terminology to their basins, and it's nonsense. So it's very shallow marine, and I'll show you in these seep deposits are probably at maximum flooding level of the Homwood Shale, and I'll show you evidence that we have to say that they're very shallow marine. And the marine influence becomes greater towards the north. So as you go from M7 to M4, and you can see that if you go and look at the units, they're much more marine in M7 than in M4. And then when you go further north in these basins, here in the Perth Basin, there are coal seams intercalated with the marine units. If you go to Timor, it's all marine. So the same thing applies as you go further north. And in these marginal rift basins, there are estuarine-like conditions. At times there was a stratified water column with disaerobic, anaerobic conditions on the floor, on the sea floor, very shallow, very low wave base because they're in interior sea. Very, very low energy shorelines in these basins. And the Baltic Sea is in many ways, a depositional analogue. It's not a structural analogue, but it's a depositional analogue for this. There are very few of these basins today when you look around to see. The other thing is that there has been very limited post-Permian burial. This sedimentation in these basins, N4 to N6, really cut out at the end of the Rhodian in the middle Permian, in the Guadalupian. There's nothing on top. There is a very thin late Cenozoic old river channel deposits, the Victoria Plateau beds. So nothing is, and they've remained pristine. One of the few areas in the world, I'd say, where that situation has occurred. Now this is Macaroni Hill, and it's encased by, and on those scarps, it's encased by shale, Homwood shale. It's a small concentration of nodules, of carbonate nodules. You can see that it's not layered limestone, but there are 3 units there. So there have been 3 episodes of seep development at that locality, and surrounded by these shales. Now the nodules, when you're looking outcrop, they're fantastic. But you can see that there are tube-like things, but they seem to be all broken up. And there's a reason for that. And so this is one of the surfaces of the nodules. When you cut them, and in this paper we've given a supplementary material file with images of about 50 nodules cut. Fantastic fabrics in them. You'll notice that there is a lot of yellow cement. Now that's characteristic, yellow or orange or cements are characteristic of methane seeps. You can see in here. The original sediment, of course, these form by precipitation, due ultimately to the presence of those AOM, anaerobically oxidizing methane microbes. Now I've lost my track of what I was going to say. But the first thing that happens is that the mud, in this case it's mud, is cemented by cryptocrystalline carbonate. Now we've used acetate peels here exclusively. We've got a few thin sections. But in this study, which is sort of a preliminary study, we haven't worried about the carbonate mineralogy. We're worried about the fabrics. It's been shown in modern seeps that there's a whole range of minerals that occur. But in some time, there'll have to be studies of the carbonate mineralogy to get the complete paragenesis of the seep cementation. But this green-brown, green-grey material is really the original clay mud material that has been cemented by cryptocrystalline carbonate. And then it's had all these other things happen to it. There are tubes here, which I'll talk about in a minute. Let's see. So let's look at the cement fabrics. These are acetate peels, and acetate peels allow you to get a whole rock, a whole slab view of the rock, and they're fantastic for looking at cement fabrics. And they take up the colour of the rock. So, and we compare them with these cements. This is from a modern seep in the St. Lawrence estuary in Canada. And this is a modern seep nodule. I should have said, first of all, this is a nodule from the Northwest Shelf, one of those seep deposits on the Northwest Shelf. And you notice, and this is in an active seep, it's porous. And the process of formation of these nodules is very dynamic. And it involves, of course, precipitation, brecciation, corrosion, recrystallization, and replacement. And then the whole process is repeated. And so you can see here brecciation, you can see the replacement of spheroidal little spheres of probably calcite, eating as it seems into the matrix. There are radial fibre, fibrous cements, botryoidal structures, cements. There is the last stage in rare examples is silica coming in, and as a last phase of the cement history. But really phenomenal cements here. So these nodules are not like, they're not like limestones that have just been cemented. And you've got to remember when we look at the biota that everything has been chopped up. Nothing is in place in the rock. And here you can see similar isopac radial fibrous cements and so forth here. And these ovoids here, which are like the ovoids up here. So very similar features to the modern cements. Unfortunately, these were just taken in thin section. And really it's best to look at the fabrics in acetate peels rather than thin section. And then the carbon and oxygen isotope values. As I said before, it's the cement fabrics that are characteristic, plus the stable isotopes, then plus the biota. And of course, many geochemists say that once you've got carbon-13 below 25 parts per thousand, then you've got a methane seep. And what we know about carbon-13 is that the values undergo only limited alteration during diagenesis, during late diagenesis. So we've got a whole group. What we did, we drilled with a micro drill, got powders from Pacific points in a number of slabs. This gives us, we've done about 20 samples. And this is a plot of the carbon-13, delta carbon-13, delta oxygen-18. Now, so the majority of the samples fall below 25 parts per thousand. And that's considered, and they go down to 45 parts per thousand. So that's considered to be indicative of methane seeps. The interesting thing is that the oxygen levels indicate either the oxygen levels values are more susceptible to diagenetic change, particularly to burial diagenesis, and if there's a high geothermal gradient in the area. But we know that there's been less than, and probably much less than 1,000 metres of burial here. And we know that there's very low thermal maturity. We can tell that from a number of biogenic indicators. And the Nangedi Formation sits on Precambrian basement, but that unconformity, it would be cold Precambrian basement. That unconformity is, I don't know how many million years, hundreds of millions of years. So, and there's no sign of any volcanic activity in this basin. So this, we think, the delta 018 values, we think reflect freshwater influence. And we have below the Homwood Shale, we have a pile of diamictites interbedded with shales, diamictites interbedded with shales. And we think that glacial meltwater trapped in the rapidly deposited glaciogene deposits may be the influence due to dewatering over time. And of course, we had melting of the permafrost and degradation of any gas hydrates. So we're sort of confident that this does indicate a freshwater influence in these. Now the biota, and when you look at modern seeps, you see thickets of tubeworms. These are cyboglybids. There are microbial mats here around a seep, and you can get concentrations of mollusk. These are mussel-like. These are mitolus type shells that you buy, like you buy at a restaurant, the mussel shells. But these harbour chemosymbionts. The microbial mats, of course, get their energy supplies from chemosynthesis. You've got to remember when you look at a rock like this, these disrupted fabrics and multi-phase cements suggest episodes of methane activity. And they're disturbing life habitats and creating, by rapid cementation, new surfaces for any sessile organisms to attach to. So this process is going on all the time. But we can recognise in these nodules a fantastic lot of forms. We can recognise those that were part of the seep ecosystem. And these are thickets, mats, as well as sessile and vagile inhabitants that lived in the seep area. We can recognise nekton and plankton from the pelagic ecosystem in the water column above. And we can recognise coastal plain, parts of the coastal plain ecosystem that have been transported in surface freshwater plumes in the surface during flood times. And opportunistic feeders that came from the shoreline in terrestrial environments out into the sea to feed above the seeps. And then we have surrounding the seep deposits, we have shale, and which encloses the seeps. And this gives the normal seafloor ecosystem. And what we can see from the shale, it's a flat, featureless seafloor with these seeps, just like you recognise on the northwest shelf or other areas. So let's look at the seep ecosystem, the thickets and the mats. We've got tubeworms, which were probably, had housed probably chemosymbionts. And here, this is a longitudinal a longitudinal section, and this is a cross section. I'll talk a bit more about these because these are quite unusual. You have tubiphytes. We've recognised this before in the Kalithara Formation and the Nara Nara, and up in Timor in the Marbisi limestone. It's probably an alga and probably photosynthesis. Then we have a group, this is one of them, problematic. This is one of the problematica. They're either algae or sponges, and we don't know really what they are. And then we get fragmented microbial lamination. Now, we're in very shallow water, and I'll give you evidence for that, chemosynthesis or photosynthesis. And here you can see these tubeworms in the Gulf of Mexico and these microbial mats in St. Lawrence Estuary. These white areas are carbonate precipitation around the mats. And the greenish here are the mats here. The green is the mats. And I'm not too sure. It'll be a couple of 100 metres probably deep there. But it was thought that these tubeworms, I'll just go on to the tubeworms now. It was thought that these tubeworms only occurred below 200 metres. But they've been found now right up to 20 metres water depth or even shallower. So that idea has been debunked in the modern seas. And the ones that occur in the seeps today are cyboglynids, this group. And we've got, the ones we've got are probably different to this. The molecular phylogeny of these suggests that they arose in the Jurassic. We're in the Permian. And the molecular phylogeny of the serpulids is not, it extends it a little bit lower, I think into the Triassic or into the late Permian. We think we've got a group that is somewhere between these. And the thing about these, the modern seep tubeworms, is that they lack a digestive system. They get their energy from the chemosymbionts within their flesh. And they're fantastic. This is from fairly deep water in the Congo fan, but this shows they have a chitinous, the tubes above the sediment interface, water interface are chitinous, non-calcareous. But the tubes that act sort of like the posterior tubes that act sort of like a root system are calcareous. And you can see that here in a cross section. We've got, you see this brown, we've got definite primary calcite in the wall, in these finely laminated walls of these things, beautifully preserved. But we've also, the brownish material will probably be, and we have to test this in future, crystallites of chitin that form the wall layers there, interspersed with calcitic, ragonitic crystals. There are a number of features that differ from cyberglinids in that these have just cylindrical tubes. We've got keels in this cross section, here and here. You can see the keel coming down here on these. And this is somewhat like serpulids, which have keels on part of the tube, and then they disappear and more ornament comes in on some of the serpulids. But a lot more work has to be done on these. But we know that they're in such abundance that they form thickets in the seep. Now let's look at they were the main components of the thickets. Now let's look at other sessile components in the seep. And here we've got remarkable non-skeletal red algae, a monostromatic, single layers of cells. Lydostroma, an algal macrophyte, which would have been attached to a hard substrate and would, like modern examples close to this, undergone photosynthesis high in the photic zone, perhaps less than 30 metres water depth. And I said that these nodules at this level represent maximum flooding of the Homwood Shale. We have a remarkable group of mollusks called rostraconchs. And this is a new group of rostraconchs, if they are rostraconchs, we think they are. These are mud stickers, and they're filter feeders, or they could have chemosymbionts in their flesh. And very rarely, in one or two nodules, we've got concentrations of crinoid stems. And here in a seep offshore Norway are feather stars, crinoids, on a seep nodule, filter feeding. So let's look. This is so significant in terms of water level. Let's look at this, and then we'll look at the rostraconchs. Now, Lydostroma was described in Oklahoma way back in 1959 from one nodule in shale in the marine Pennsylvanian of Oklahoma. It occurred just above a coal bed in that. The Pennsylvanian of the southern US is very similar to our Permian here in these interior basins. They're very elements that are really very similar. Here is the thing that was described in a thin section in Oklahoma. It's been recorded tentatively in Europe, a couple of localities. But here is the first record in Gondwana, and it's abundant in these rocks. We know that it's not a seep obligate organism because it also occurs at the fossil cliff interval higher in the Homwood Shale, in nodules we're studying at the moment. And we've been able to extract whole bits of it. It's similar in lifestyle to modern red monostromatic algae, and these are epibionts on firm surfaces high in the photic zone. They're in fact, these things are harvested for food in Japan and places like that. And so this is what they would have looked like in life. They also have, importantly for the depth story, they also have epiphytic porcelaneous forams attached to them, just like seagrasses and algae in very shallow water out here today. And we know that these sort of porcelaneous forams are today very shallow water. But interesting, the same sort of epiphytes occur in this Oklahoma occurrence. So we should take note of of the comparison between the Pennsylvanian in these interior basins in North America with our early Permian. Then the other group, the rostroconchs. Now these are bivalve. When you look at it, you might think, oh, these are brachiopods or something like this. But these are bivalved mollusks with fused shells. They're exceedingly unusual. So they can't, in the adult, they can't open their valves, their shells. They were thought, they became extinct at the end of the Permian. They're sessile, they were thought to be, most of them, sessile filter feeders. But most have very strong ornament, like this one that Michael Amler illustrated here. And they have a rostrum that is regarded as posterior. Now, these shells also have another unusual feature. So this is the hinge, and you can see that hinge cannot be functional. There are these growths under it. There's no way that you can get that could open. This, when I first saw it in the acetate peel, I thought, we've got a crab claw. And of course I was wrong. Peter Joel from Queensland pointed out that it's the hinge area, the dorsal area, looking down the hinge of these things. This here is the posterior part, which is truncated. We don't see the rostrum. This is the anterior part here. And this hole here is this hole. This cavity here is just a cavity under here. And in the anterior ventral part, this is ventral, this is dorsal of these shells, they have these peculiar shelves. They look a little bit like ostracods of the crustacean group. And they're only in the anterior ventral part of the shell. So this here is a part of a shell that is probably maybe through here somewhere. This is another one of these, and this is probably way off down here somewhere. Now, did they have chemosymbionts? Well, we haven't found these particular rostroconchs anywhere else. They haven't been recorded anywhere else. So that's a good pointer that they may very well have had chemosymbionts and been like these mitolus-like bivalves that lives at seeps with chemosymbionts.
Excuse me, David, you've been speaking for about 52 minutes.
Oh.
Are you on track for...
I thought it was only 35 minutes. Your clock is going. Yeah, well, this is a seep. These are the vagile inhabitants. The gastropod, this one might have chemosymbionts, but they're ostracods. These are scalechodonts, organic, from the jaw apparatus of polychaete worms. The tubeworms are polychaetes, but these are normal marine worms. And this is the last slide of the biota, then I've only got 2 slides. Then we have there's another slide of the biota. But the coastal plain ecosystem, We have from land plants spores and pollen, and we have freshwater phytoplankton. And these have come out in surface plumes of fresh water from a highly vegetated coastal plain. And also there are these things. There are 3 slides of Biota left. These things we think are vertebrate remains, and you can see here a ball and socket joint. We think there are tetrapods, and they're possibly amphibians. We have to try and extract them. Remember, these are seen in acetate peel. But they would have swum out, if they are amphibians, from the coast out to these soups of organic richness over the seeps. The seafloor, very unusual. Here is the forearm assemblage in the shales, and here is in the seeps. Totally different. And very unusual in terms of a shale fauna. They're single-chambered forms. In the shales, there are no moulds of macrofossils. And in the normal calcareous mudstone nodules that you get in the shales, away from the seep, where you get the ammonoids, shells preserved, there are no benthic skeletons. So there were low levels of oxygen on the sea floor around the seeps. And here are the ammonoids that I talked about. This is the most abundant ammonoid assemblage anywhere in Australia, Permian. And we can see now that it's associated with food emanating from the seeps, the high abundance. There's another little ammonoid, Uraloceras. These give the age as about 293 plus or minus 2 MA. Now the summary of evidence for methane seeps then is that complex multi-phase cement fabrics, consistent with modern seeps, the values, the carbon-13, the delta carbon-13 values, very negative, very low, based on similar to modern seeps. And I'm told by the geochemists that you can only get those sort of values where you've got methane present. And the fossil assemblage is comparable to the biota of modern seeps. And this is a new finding because the other Paleozoic seeps that have been documented very poorly in terms of fossil assemblages have been quite different to modern seeps. And then what the Russians do in the modern faunas off the North Siberian coast is when they want to see if it's a seep community or a non-seep community, they use control sites and compare with control sites. So we compare our seep assemblage with coeval, the same age limestones elsewhere in WA, and we find total difference. There's nothing that compares to these. And even with normal early diagenetic nodules in the shale elsewhere, these are very different. We're studying these at the moment, the biota in those at the moment. So the source of the methane, we think it's biogenic methane derived from buried coastal plain plants, and it's undergone the anaerobic oxidation of the methane by microbes, etc. But we have also fresh water derived from dewatering of the meltwater trapped in the glacial pile through burial diagenesis, and that explains the delta 018. And also we've got warming and permafrost degradation, plus any degradation of the associated gas hydrates. And here you can see that the Nangedi it's speculated to be 1,000 metres. We know that the Lions group in the Mullinley Basin is greater than 1,500 metres. And then the Homwood Shale, these are at about 60 70, 80 metres above the base of the Holmwood Shale on the sea floor. And we have this late Sackmerian warming, which we've recognised before, this warm spike, which is added to this. So the conclusions, you can read, I think they're pretty clear, what I've said. So let me just acknowledge, this hasn't been funded at all. You can do a lot without any funding. And we get some logistics support from these places, and of course field assistance and technical assistance. So thanks. Sorry for running over.
Okay,
I've got no, since I retired, I've got no sense of time. So.